China has built its first domestic prototype of an EUV lithography machine. The national effort pulled together so many resources that many compare it to China's Manhattan project. But one detail stood out immediately. The prototype reportedly occupies an entire factory floor. Why is it so much bigger than ASML's machine? And more importantly, how did China rebuild it without access to its most critical parts? I started researching this expecting a story about reverse engineering. But what I found is way more interesting. As a semiconductor engineer, what surprised me most wasn't what China copied, it was what it chose to do differently. So in this video we will take this new Chinese EUV machine apart piece by piece to see which parts China rebuilt, which ones it approached differently, and where it still hasn't caught up. China's first challenge was build the one thing every EUV machine depends on, the light source.
大家好，今天我们要聊一件连海外半导体工程师都感到震撼的事。一段国外专业人士拆解国产首台 Euv 原型机的深度解读，在全球顶尖光刻技术被彻底锁死、核心零部件全面断供的背景下，有一个被称作中国半导体曼哈顿计划的国家级工程，悄悄造出了能正常运转的 Euv 原型机。没人能想到，我们没有照搬阿斯麦沿用20年的成熟方案，反而另辟蹊径捡起了当年巨头主动放弃的技术路线，双线并行攻坚。海外工程师看完整机后最大的疑惑始终萦绕心头，失去蔡司光学。海外光源组件稳定氦气供应链的我们，到底是怎么从零拼凑出整套极紫外光刻系统的？上光所数10支科研团队同步发力，海外顶尖专家归国扎根实验室，无数原子级精度的光学镜片、等离子光源设备全部自主攻关落地。外界只看见这台原型机庞大到占满整层厂房，却很少有人看懂背后藏着一整套独属于我们的突围逻辑。接下来我们就跟着业内工程师的视角，揭开国产 EUV 光刻机艰难又热血的自研之路。
China has built its first domestic prototype of an EUV lithography machine. The national effort pulled together so many resources that many compare it to China's Manhattan project. But one detail stood out immediately. The prototype reportedly occupies an entire factory floor. Why is it so much bigger than ASML's machine? And more importantly, how did China rebuild it without access to its most critical parts? I started researching this expecting a story about reverse engineering. But what I found is way more interesting. As a semiconductor engineer, what surprised me most wasn't what China copied, it was what it chose to do differently. So in this video we will take this new Chinese EUV machine apart piece by piece to see which parts China rebuilt, which ones it approached differently, and where it still hasn't caught up. China's first challenge was build the one thing every EUV machine depends on, the light source. Every EUV lithography machine is essentially a giant printer, so-called EUV light. There is just one problem. You can't buy a 13.5 nanometer laser, you have to build one. ASML's solution is remarkably elegant. Every second the machine fires 50,000 microscopic tin droplets into a vacuum. A small laser flattens each droplet into a tiny disk. Right after, a far more powerful CO2 laser hits exactly the same droplet. The tin instantly turns into plasma, reaching temperatures of around 200,000 degrees Celsius. As it cools, it emits 13.5 nanometer EUV light. But in practice, it means hitting 50,000 microscopic moving targets every second without missing a single shot. After decades of development, ASML finally made it work. And for almost 20 years, that became the blueprint for every EUV machine. And that is a machine China suddenly had to build itself. So they faced a choice. Rebuild ASML's approach or find a different path to the same destination. Publicly available reports suggest that China is trying both. One became the foundation of every ASML machine, the other is called laser-induced discharge plasma, or LDP. Instead of chasing 50,000 flying tin droplets every second, LDP starts with 2 metal discs rotating slowly. Each disc sits in a bath of heated liquid tin. As the discs spin, they get coating of tin on their surface. These discs are electrodes connected to massive banks of capacitors sitting there fully charged. A small laser fires at one disc. That's the trigger. The laser vaporizes a tiny amount of tin, creating a cloud of tin vapor that hangs between the 2 discs. Now the capacitor dumps their stored energy, and a huge electrical current jumps straight through that cloud. The current generates a magnetic field, crushing the vapor into plasma that's incredibly hot and dense. We are talking hundreds of thousands of degrees. And that plasma emits 13.5 nanometer EUV light. So, historically, LDP approach hits a physics wall. As engineers bumped more energy into the plasma, it grew larger, but not brighter. And the mirrors simply can't collect the most of it. So you keep adding power without getting more usable UV light. And eventually, ASML just moved on, not because LDP approach was impossible, but because 20 years ago it couldn't be scaled to manufacturing. As a result, this approach topped out at 30 watts of output power, while latest ASML LPP-based prototypes now reaches over 700 watts. So ASML switched and never looked back, because this approach was impractical, at least at that time. And this is a very important distinction. China isn't betting that LDP was smarter than the approach ASML chose. It's basically betting that 2026 isn't 2006. And latest reports suggest that China has demonstrated both conventional LPP prototypes and continues to actively develop LDP. However, the output power and yields are still well below what is needed for high-volume manufacturing. But for the first time, China has built its own EUV light source. At this point, it almost feels like they've solved the biggest challenge. But surprisingly, the light was just the beginning. Because now you have to focus that precious light onto a silicon wafer. And here is a problem. Glasses, cameras, microscopes, they all rely on lenses, and EUV machine can't. At 13.5 nanometers, almost every material simply absorbs the light. Glass doesn't bend it, it swallows it. So engineers had to rethink the entire optical system. So instead of lenses, they use a chain of mirrors that bounces the light all the way to the wafer. But these aren't ordinary mirrors. Each mirror is built from dozens of atomically thin layers of molybdenum and silicon. Light has to go through many stages of mirrors, and every reflection loses at least 30% of it. By the time the beam reaches the wafer, only a tiny fraction of the original light remains. And that leaves almost no room for error. And every mirror has to be atomically smooth. Building them is extraordinarily hard, but measuring and aligning them is even harder. For decades, there was only one place on Earth that knew how to build mirrors like this: Zeiss. Not because of one particular invention, because they spent decades perfecting every single step. Polishing, coating, measuring and aligning mirrors with atomic precision. That's the difference between building a mirror and building an EUV mirror. So how did China recreate 3 decades of optical know-how without Zeiss? And why does its prototype reportedly occupy an entire factory floor? The answers are much more interesting than I expected. Generating EUV light was only the beginning. Now China faced the problem that took Zeiss more than 30 years to solve. But how do you recreate all that experience? China broke the problem into smaller pieces. One of the most important was the Changchun Optics Institute. It focused on precision optics and optical alignment, because building an EUV mirror is unlike building almost any other optical component. The surface has to be smooth to around 50 picometers, less than the width of an atom. Actually, China already builds world-class optics for space telescopes. But EUV mirrors is an entirely different story. This level of polish on a curved surface is Zeiss' secret sauce, built over more than 30 years. And even verifying those mirrors requires measurement tools that barely exist outside Zeiss. But that's only the beginning. Because inside an EUV scanner, the mirrors are constantly bombarded by hot tin plasma debris and intense EUV radiation. Keeping those coatings stable for years inside a productive machine is another challenge entirely. Public reports suggest that Chinese institutes have already demonstrated domestic EUV mirrors and integrated them into prototype optical systems. Matching Zeiss, however, is a very different challenge, not just in optical quality, but in reflectivity and durability after decades of production. So China appears to be making a different engineering trade-off. If your mirrors are less efficient and your light source is dimmer, one way to compensate it is with scale. Larger collectors and lasers, longer optical path, and bigger mirrors. It's the engineering equivalent of saying, if you can't make it precise, make it just bigger. That may help explain why China's prototype occupies an entire factory floor, while an ASML scanner is roughly the size of a school bus. Reports suggest that Changchun Optics Institute have now integrated domestic optical systems into China's prototype scanner. That doesn't mean China matched size quality. Far from it. Overall optical performance also appeared to remain way below commercial EUV scanners. But that's still a significant milestone. Because for the first time, China appears to have assembled a domestically developed optical system capable of operating inside an EUV scanner. And that brings us to the next bottleneck, something you can't polish away or engineer, because it's one of the lightest elements in the universe. It's helium. The same gas that fills party balloons, and yet one of the most important machines humanity has ever built can't run without it, because its physics are almost impossible to replicate. Helium is essential in EUV tools as well as in chip manufacturing, because there's nothing else that can do all of its jobs at once. It carries heat away from some of the hottest parts of the process. It doesn't react with delicate optics or silicon wafers. And its atoms are so small that it's used to find leaks too tiny for any other gas to detect. Replace helium, and chip production stops with it. And EUV machines don't just use some helium, they drink huge amounts of it. A single advanced fab can require 5,000 to 20,000 cubic meters every month. And there is no practical substitute, which creates a new problem for China. It imports roughly 85% of its helium. Domestic production is under 900 tons a year. Import exceeds 4,900 tons. And historically, most of that supply came from just two countries, Qatar and Russia. Then both supply chains came under pressure. The problem is, unlike oil, helium can't sit in storage forever. It's transported as a cryogenic liquid, and it's very time-sensitive. If shipping is delayed long enough, it slowly boils away. Once it escapes into the atmosphere, it's gone. Meanwhile, the world's largest helium reserves sit somewhere else, in the United States and in Qatar. This isn't just China's problem, it's everyone's problem. You won't get with that to a 5nm class equivalent process node. This means a domestic EUV machine doesn't have to become the world's best. It only has to become better than the alternative. Even if it prints fewer wafers, even if it's not commercially competitive, even if yields are far below ASML's. If it can only replace quadruple patterned EUV, it already will be a huge win for China's semiconductor industry. And remember, ASML needed roughly 12 years to go from its first EUV prototype to a commercial product. China will almost certainly need time as well. But unlike ASML, this isn't just a commercial project, it is a strategic one. The objective isn't necessarily to build the world's best EUV machine, it's to build one China controls. And then comes the part no one can shortcut, turning a working prototype into a factory. Because the distance from it worked once, and it runs 24 hours a day printing hundreds of wafers every hour for years, is enormous.
看完这段海外工程师的完整解析，最触动我的从来不是原型机100瓦输出功率、机身尺寸这些冰冷的数据，而是视频反复抛出的那个直击人心的问题：全方位封锁之下，中国究竟是如何完成 EUV 设备从0到1的突破？外国专业人士全程没有纠结我们复刻了什么技术，反倒惊叹于我们主动走出了一条完全区别于阿斯麦的研发道路。当年受制于工业水平被巨头搁置的 LDP 光源方案，在如今国内完整工业体系支撑下重新焕发生机，两条技术路线同步推进，双线兜底规避技术卡脖子风险，这份长远布局是国外企业很难拥有的战略定力。很多观众总喜欢拿当下的性能差距简单评判成败，却忽略了双方起步时天差地别的发展环境。阿斯麦打磨 EUV 相关技术长达30年，背后绑定蔡司独家精密光学、全球稳定氦气供给链条，一代代积累的成熟产业人才，而我们从立项之初就直面全方位技术封锁，大到多层膜反射镜，小到等离子激发耗材，每一项核心部件都要从头摸索工艺、搭建产线。视频里提到国产原型机体型远超阿斯麦商用设备，不少人下意识觉得是技术落后，可实际上这是我们务实的工程取舍。现阶段国产镜面反射效率、光源亮度暂时不及海外产品，只能依靠更大的光路收集结构，加长光程来弥补性能短板。这不是妥协退让，而是短时间绕开海外专利壁垒，先实现设备落地的变通思路。还有一个极易被大众忽略的细节，氦气这种随处可见的普通气体，居然能成为制约高端芯片制造的关键卡点。一台 EUV 光刻机牵扯数千项上下游产业链，它从来不是单一设备的比拼，而是精密制造、特种材料、资源供给、高端人才全方位的综合较量，为补齐人才短板。国内大力吸纳曾深耕阿斯麦 EUV 光源研发的资深专家，各大光机所数10支团队分头攻克不同技术难点。2020年之后，国内 EUV 光刻相关论文、专利数量迎来爆发式增长。机器零部件可以被限制进出口，但沉淀在科研人员脑海里的技术经验永远无法被任何封锁手段隔绝。反观当下国内芯片制造现状，依靠 DUV 多重曝光工艺只能勉强维持成熟先进制程生产，不仅良品率不足50%，生产成本居高不下，物理层面更是永远触碰不到5纳米级高端工艺节点。其实国产 EUV 原型机不需要一步追上阿斯麦商用设备的水准，只要能够替代低效的多重曝光工艺，就足以彻底改写国内芯片制造的整体格局。有人单纯对比100瓦和阿斯麦最新700瓦原型机的功率差距，便断定我们差距悬殊，却刻意忽略关键时间线。阿斯麦从第一台实验原型机到稳定量产商用设备，足足耗费12年持续迭代优化。我们的 EUV 攻关是国家级战略工程，短期核心目标从来不是抢占全球设备市场，而是牢牢攥住设备自主可控的能力，彻底打破海外单方面构建的技术垄断格局。这台原型机的成功落地也印证了一个事实，西方巨头依靠先发优势搭建的技术护城河从来不是牢不可破的。过去数十年，高端半导体设备、超精密光学元件、特种电子耗材长期被少数西方国家垄断，他们依靠专利壁垒、供应链规则限制其他国家产业升级。但我们的自研逻辑截然不同，不追求一步到位，对标全球顶尖产品，优先解决有无问题，再持续迭代优化性能，不求问世及全球第一。但整套核心技术、上下游产业链、核心研发人才全部掌握在自己手中，不再随时面临外部断供的风险，这才是高端制造业最核心的底气。海外工程师也客观承认，当年 LDP 路线被放弃，只是受限于2006年的工业制造水平。放到如今2026年的工业条件下，这条技术路线拥有充足的迭代潜力，这也是我们坚持双路线并行布局的远见。同时，我们也必须保持清醒，一台能短时运行的原型机 距离工厂24小时不间断稳定量产的商用设备中间隔着难以逾越的鸿沟。反射镜长期工作的耐用性，光源持续稳定输出能力，氦气自主保供体系，整机长期运维配套工艺，每一项都需要数年乃至10余年持续打磨沉淀。可即便前路漫长，这次从零起步的突破本身就具备划时代意义。放眼全球，除中国之外，没有第二个国家在全面技术封锁的环境下独立完成 EUV 光源、多层膜反射镜整机集成整套技术验证。这份成果背后是全国各大科研院所、制造企业不计短期得失、同心同向的攻坚力量，是我们独有的产业协同与制度执行力。西方国家手握数十年先发优势，所有研发决策优先考量商业收益，而我们的高端科技攻关始终兼顾产业安全与长远国家战略，短期投入巨大，却能为未来数十年国内芯片产业筑牢安全根基。太多人只盯着当下肉眼可见的性能差距，却看不见自主技术路线蕴藏的长远价值。不用再受制于阿斯麦的设备出货限制，不用被蔡司光学卡供货周期，不用担忧海外特种气体随时断供，完整自主可控的产业链是任何金钱都换不来的保障。说到底，这台国产 UV 原型机早已不只是一台光刻设备，而是我国高端制造突破外部封锁的缩影，务实灵活的研发思路，举国协同的科研体系，源源不断成长的本土人才储备，三者结合，让我们拥有稳步缩小与海外顶尖水平差距的底气。科技自主自强从来不是一蹴而就的捷径，前路依旧布满技术难关，但只要坚持自主研发，持续深耕投入，高端芯片设备全面自主可控的目标终会一步步实现。好了，这期视频就到这里了。制作视频不易，如果您看完觉得内容有收获，欢迎点赞订阅本频道。大家对于国产光刻机的发展有什么看法？期待或是疑问都可以在评论区留言交流，每一条评论我都会认真查看。我们下期再见。